So great to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited too, because we're talking about stuff that I don't know, sometimes it can be difficult to quote unquote go there,
Hmm.
but we are at a time on this earth where this is needful. These kinds of conversations are needful.
Mhm.
So why don't you kind of start with anything that might be pertinent for our listeners to kind of get to know you, why you're doing the work you're doing, especially as it relates to shadow work. And I know you're in Portugal right now, which we've had a crazy time trying to connect our times and whatever, but now it's just perfect. But when I originally connected with you, you were in Bali. Now you're all the way over in Portugal. You're like a world globetrotter right now, spreading healing
I
all over the place. Yeah, share with our listeners kind of what took you into the work you're now doing.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a journey. I guess the Coles notes of it is I lived a very different life many years ago. Despite being young, a lot of history and a lot of things that have unfolded in my life that kind of led me down some not so healthy paths. And I was heading in, yeah, just not the best direction. Wasn't very good at taking care of myself, very unhealthy relationships. And I wouldn't say that I consciously thought that as much at the time because that was just my normal experience. But I did know at certain points that I needed to change my life and quite drastically. So I ended up moving to a new city where I didn't know anybody. And through a series of synchronicities, my life just began completely changing and 180. And, there's so many different levels to why it changed. I think environment does really help when we can be in a new space. But I was led to a women's group where we did a lot of this work and I learned about shadow work, inner child work, and some somatics and all this other stuff, learning how my family system impacted me today and my relationships and all that. And I ended up diving down years and many hours of intensive training and doing even quite advanced shadow work trainings where I did some programs that are next level uncomfortable and just put you into such a place of discomfort and having to face things that is really hard in front of 40 other people, men and women. So I just did a lot of stuff to really explore and know my mind. And I think that's the kind of foundational piece of it is I really wanted to know my mind and kind of
Mm,
challenge
what a powerful
myself.
statement. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
And through the mirrors of other people, which is really, the foundation of shadow work and how that's kind of at the base of a lot of the things that I learned. So shadow work, I'd say, was the main initial pillar that I was getting into this work with. And after years of participating training, I started taking over as the facilitator for that women's group that I was in. And then eventually started doing stuff on my own and offering that. And then through more study and through time, I got more into the somatics and nervous system work. So it's this kind of trying to bridge these two worlds of the
Right.
more intensive shadow work where it can be quite destabilizing and then bring in the power of nervous system work and
Nourishing
somatics
that.
to make it possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the sweet spot of growth. It's not push yourself off a cliff and do something you're not ready and prepared to do. It's like what's that middle ground of pushing it just enough where you can still make change happen, but it's not overwhelming to your system. So that's kind of my work and how I've brought these things together.
That's beautiful. And I can tell when someone's done the work when they say, I'm running late, but I surrendered to it. And I'm like, oh, because that was your email to me. And I'm like, oh, she's in it. Like she's doing the work. That's not something someone says if, you know, they have stressful life situations happening.
Yeah.
Uh, unless they've done the work, I should say. So let's go into that. Let's go into specifically how do you define shadow work? I've had a couple of episodes on this and I frequently will just drop that like phrase to my listeners. But how do you explain it to people?
Mm-hmm.
Shadow work.
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. I think it can be kind of ambiguous at times and people have different ideas of it. To put it very simply, I would say there's the Carl Jung quote, which is to make the, I'm going to mess up this quote, I always do, basically to make the unconscious conscious, right?
Right. I know what quote you're thinking of, and I would mess it up too, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
It goes,
like that's the whole work, is to make whatever is unconscious conscious. Yeah.
Right. So then he says, so it won't direct your life and you'll call it fate. Something that's slightly wrong, but that's the basic premise of it. So on a little bit of a more technical term, it's our subconscious mind is the majority of our brain functioning. And of course, that kind of includes the very automatic responses and functioning of our body. But there's a lot of mental things that happen there, right? Our dreams could reveal parts of our shadow. Our judgments of other people help us understand our shadow. And it's essentially the parts of ourselves that we've rejected and are holding on to pain, shame, right? Internalized, I'm not enough, that create certain situations in your external world through your thoughts, behaviors, and choices, right? So we basically see how the part of your shadow or your shadow is influencing and affecting and actually directing your life, whether you realize it's happening or not. Well, a lot of the time people don't, because you can't just ask your subconscious mind, like, what's going on down there? It's not working, right?
Can you like put this in my language of logic, please?
Yeah.
Well, I like that definition, and I'm a huge Jung enthusiast, so I love that you brought him into that. It's the real work. I used to think that, and I was totally conditioned with this ideology that if you aren't feeling good, you did something wrong. Right? So like if I'm not feeling, let's just say the good fruits of the spirit, like it talks about in the Bible, love, joy, peace, compassion, all the stuff. If I'm not feeling those feelings, most of the time, then my humanness or my natural self or my bad side, if you will, has taken over. And so I need to really I really need to double down on the good spiritual practices so I don't feel those bad feelings. That was my paradigm for like the first 45 years of my life. And I have a psychology degree and I understand, like I've done emotional healing stuff or whatever, but it was the spiritual piece, because my whole career is focused on emotional healing, not realizing for the past 20 years that in actuality, what I was doing was emotional and spiritual bypassing. So not showing up in let's just say a messy human way. And that was terrifying, to be able to just be that vulnerable and show up messy and say, I'm in a shadow, I'm going through a shadow phase. I'm working through deep intergenerational stuff, right? I kind of, even though I may have had the knowing that I felt like I kind of had to hold it together to seem more spiritual.
Yeah.
And that stoicism can be really unhealthy. Yeah.
It's kind of like, I mean, we all have the capacity to be angry, sad, judgmental, greedy, right? Jealous, like all these things that we label as wrong and bad are just very normal human experiences. And I think you're definitely not alone in that. And I think a lot of people are still in that and haven't. I think the thing is we just don't have examples of what it means to be embraced in that. We don't have often. People don't have peers around them or parent figures or anyone to show them and teach them about showing up in that messy way. So it's just this kind of like vanished thing that people don't talk about. Therefore, how are you supposed to expand into your capacity to show that side of you, to accept that part of you if it's not welcomed or embraced, or even people being curious about it?
Yeah, there's a lot of stigma in that.
Yeah, and people don't even it breaks my heart that even if somebody has the desire to heal and grow and open up more, that a lot of people just, I don't think, have the connections in the community around them of like true care, like how are you really doing today? I've been noticing you seem a little bit off. Is there anything going on? Do you want somebody to talk to? Can I bring you some food? Like the power of people really taking an interest in in each other's lives. Like we're kind of just so busy and self-focused that I think people are really lacking the communal aspect that makes that more accessible.
Yeah, I agree. Like if you were really sick, let's just say you were going through chemotherapy or you lost a loved one or something more overt, then people will rally, right?
Mhm.
But checking in with people to assess and support and validate, especially validate,
Mhm.
is missing. And because of that stoicism, like because it's less spiritual, quote unquote, or normal
Mhm.
but actually that is the norm, right? The norm is to cycle through shadow.
Mhm.
And it's what's throwing our system off is when we try to suppress it. So like I have this saying, if you suppress and if you'll eventually oppress because hurt people hurt people. If you
Mhm.
don't have a way to express, then that's what you'll do. You'll suppress, oppress, and eventually you'll get depressed.
Mhm.
And yeah, so sharing this with you earlier before we started recording, but I was in Australia and we did a 3-city tour of emotional healing, emotional release with essential oils specifically, but we did a lot of diving into this shadow piece. And we talked to our audiences about, and I totally want to go there because you dropped this word shame put that on the table. And it's so interesting because if you look at David Hawkins' map of consciousness, the lowest vibratory state that we know of is shame. And so many people try to heal with the energy of shame. So many
Mhm.
people, quote unquote, repent with the energy of shame, thinking that that's going to bring them to a space of healing.
Mhm.
And that's just the spiritual part of it. The emotional part of it is, like you had mentioned, I'm not blank enough. And that's shame.
Mhm.
So how do we open up for this I guess to dive into the shadows? There's no other way to do it. The only way out is through. You can't bypass over it. If it's here, it's here. How do you get
Mhm.
into that shadow without experiencing the shame? What is there a certain practice or a certain way that you have worked with your people to do that?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, so if shame arises, it's okay. It's usually a part of that shedding, but we don't feed into it or make it bigger. And we try to manage it and get through it and release it. So that's exactly right. Like we can't, it's like trying to heal shame with shame. I feel I'm not enough, therefore I'm not showing up as fully as I'd like to in life, and I need to feel bad about that, which is just running this
I
endless
feel shame
circle.
that I feel shame.
Yeah, I'm shameful for being shameful. So it's
I'm so ashamed that I
how,
have shame.
exactly. Like, how do we ever get off that hamster wheel? We don't. And that's where you have a lot of people, kind of believing that they're broken in some sense and they need to dedicate their entire life and thought process to healing, which I think there can be times where we need to give it a lot more energy than others. But, ideally, healing should allow us to have spaciousness and experience more fun and play and love and connection because we're allowing ourselves to be with the discomfort and the challenge, right? So we're creating that spaciousness in our life. But I think for a lot of people, if we're not releasing the shame, then we almost don't get out of the challenging emotions because it's just this like cycle that we're describing. So Brené Brown talks a lot about shame and
Mhm.
thinks that she has a quote about shame surviving in secrecy, right? So what I've found to be really true, I mentioned earlier that I've lived quite a life and had some stuff in my past and came from a lot of shit and a lot of trauma. And I have some things that I carried so much shame about for so many years. And it took me a long time to open up about that stuff. And what really helped me move through it, now I don't experience shame when I talk about it, I can laugh about it, is having again that supportive community and people to talk to. And even if you don't have like a women's group or somewhere to go, um, finding one kind of safe person that you can talk about these things with, because shame wants to keep us separate and wants to say you're bad, you're wrong, you need to
Mhm.
keep this hidden, don't show this part of you, right? Keep it locked in. And then it grows. But if we share it with other people and we're so terrified, and then at the end of it, we're like, oh, I'm actually more connected. I'm actually more seen. I'm actually more like this person than I realized. Therefore, I don't have to continue holding on to this fear that it's going to make me wrong or bad or unlovable, right? Because that's kind of the narrative is,
Yeah.
if I show this part of me, I'm not going to be loved. So we need to prove that wrong by sharing it with the right people in order to be loved anyway.
Yes. Yes. And oftentimes spiritual communities and religious communities don't always have that supportive neutrality.
Mhm.
One thing, and let's just like riff on this a minute about shame, like the deep fear underneath shame is I'm going to be rejected. People really knew that I was not enough of whatever, or I did this or that, or if they really knew about my past or this or that, or whatever, what I think or where I'm at, then they wouldn't love me, as you mentioned, and then underneath that, well, what happens if that happens? This is kind of the journey I like to take people on, is like, what is the worst case scenario of being vulnerable, of being open and expressing? Because it takes a lot more energy to push something down than it does to let it out. But the brain doesn't think that. The brain and the subconscious body really just holds on to that because of the fear of what I'm about. So anyway, so you just keep asking, like, what is the fear? Okay, so what if I share it? Well, then people will think I'm, whatever, they'll reject me. Okay, well, what happens if they reject you? Well, then they won't love me. Well, then what if they don't love me? Well, then they'll go away from me. Well, then what happens if they go away from you? Well, then I'll be abandoned. Well, what happens if you get abandoned? Well, I'll be alone. And that, to me, is the core fear, is being alone.
Yeah.
Not having community. Brene Brown has done a lot of work with us too, like not belonging, like what it means to not belong. That is such a core existential fear that we each carry, that we would almost do anything. We would sell ourselves out. We would be inauthentic to who we are. We would stuff, we would hide, we would go into secrecy because of that core fear. Do you want to speak to that at all in what you've seen with that?
Yes, thank you. There's just so much yes in my body of goosebumps. I learned a really powerful ancestral resolution process with a teacher, and part of it is going through the core fear and narrowing it down. So very similar process. Well, what would be the worst thing that could happen to you if that happened? And you just keep repeating that thing, or what's the worst part about that, right? And then you get to the core things. And there's a few other ones that people can arrive to, but the alone is usually at the base of it all and is one of the most common. In fact, probably the one I've seen 98% of the time. So that's absolutely true. And it's the irony of like, okay, so the fear is, well, I'll be alone. So I'll hide and I'll pretend and I'll mask, but then I'm going to be accepted for a version of me that I'm not. So it'll be like really half fulfilling, or like
in a way,
not even
like you're
half.
already alone if you're not authentic. You're already alone, but you think that you're in a state of authentic belonging.
Yeah. It's like trading mediocre connection for the fear of being alone, but that also robs you of the chance of being totally accepted and loved and belonging for who you are, messiness and all, and that's what we're really craving.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the work of Dr. Gabor Mate? I think that's how you say his name.
Yeah.
So he's amazing. And I don't know if you've looked at kind of his definition of trauma, but he says the worst kind of trauma is to chronically be inauthentic to who you are. In other words, we tend to think of these really horrible and horrific things that can happen, and that's for sure really deep trauma. But the deepest kind of trauma is chronically showing up as something other than you're not. So for instance, someone who's LGBTQ and they're hiding that identity, someone who is sitting in a space where they know something is wrong or something's off, and they're just showing up as a fake version of themselves. And when that happens over time, chronically, it's like a really complex trauma. So it's kind of what we were just talking about. If our worst fear is being alone and we would do anything to belong, and this is subconscious, by the way, we're not consciously thinking, I need to really belong. Sometimes we are, but usually we're not. because it is an ancestral thing, it's like people have been killed and burned and whatever for having an original, authentic, embodied belief, let's just say, or knowing. They've been killed. They've been ostracized from the group. They've been shamed publicly. Have you seen that show up in your work at all? That core, like it goes all the way back. I don't even know how many generations.
Yes. And just quick little thought there. I also work with facilitators I help them learn how to offer this work, and the amount of people that are still afraid of that because of cancel culture and bringing yourself online is subjecting yourself to basically that. Like it's like the modern day witch hunt, in a sense. So there's a lot of that I think has been perpetuated, not just now, but as you're saying, for many generations. So yeah, the ancestral work is so fascinating. It's one of my favorite things. You can look at somebody's entire, basically a family tree, and it's called a traumagram. So I get people to map out these traumograms and see all of the repetitive themes. And a lot of the time it's stuff that happens directly with, mom and dad, if you had both a mom and a dad, things like that. And then there's the carried on themes that maybe got passed down more behaviorally, or even through the study of epigenetics, which is how our genes.
Right. So fascinating.
Yeah, we're basically preparing to be in that environment because our body doesn't know we're going to be in a different one. So we adapt and basically inherit certain trauma responses, which is the brilliant way of the body, but doesn't really tend to help.
That's why there's so much. This is my theory about anxiety right now, why it's so pervasive, especially with your generation, because you guys are kind of like the cleanup crew. Well, we all are. But the early, like I look at like late millennial and Gen Zs as the literal cleanup crew. So you guys take it all in, and there's this, it could be a chronic, just like either a chronic low grade anxiety, and not that everyone else isn't feeling it, but it's like, it's like the culmination of thousands of years and multi-generations in your body right now going, you're the ones that see it and feel it, the collective stuff going on, and you'll be the ones with the solution. And that's why you have to feel it first. I'm Gen X, and I very much have felt that a similar way, just because I've always had a really strong sense of mission and just trying to figure out what's going on here and how can we fix this really, or move through this. And it's so interesting that, and I have kids in their 20s, that they're sharing with me what it's like to not be old enough yet, or have the maturity enough, or the backing, or the resources that you would need to make the changes you want to make. But give it like 10 years from now, and I think we're going to have a different earth, because unknowingly, a lot of people are doing their shadow work just by experiencing this feeling, this anxiety, this angst collectively.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a real also pendulum swing from maybe past schools of thought or ways of thinking of just figure it out yourself, stay strong, keep it together, right? The very much like hyper individualistic kind of conditioning. Yes. Versus now where people are opening up more to needing other people. And of course, it's a balance. We need to be able to self-soothe and take care of ourselves and be responsible adults. But we also need to open up and rely on other people emotionally, right? Especially when it comes to attachment and being securely attached and in a relationship. So it is a mix. And, I see with so many people really craving the ways of community. And of course, having a community comes with its own stuff that you have to figure out. But thinking about how many initiatives there are to, for people that are buying land and starting community projects where people are all going to be living there and growing food and doing stuff like that. Again, I think it can work sometimes, and other times it doesn't.
Not
but
so
I
much.
feel like this change towards this is what we're needing, because we're not meant to figure it all out alone all the time.
Yeah, and I do think there's going to have to be some cataclysmic shift in the consciousness that people are kind of, for lack of a better term, forced into community of this kind, because that's the only way we're really going to heal, is to connect to the earth and each other and authentically, not Instagrammy, right? Like nothing wrong with social media, but I'm just saying, like, we're seeing, illusory forms of connection en masse. And there's authentic connection online as well. That's the other paradox of all this. But let's talk a little bit about shadow work and relationships, because I know this is something that you kind of specialize in. And but before we do that, I just want to highlight what you just previously shared about when we are doing the shadow and the shame work. There still needs to be this element of nourishment, specifically to the nervous system, which most people don't, it's not our go-to, because we want to just go into apathy a lot of times, or just not do anything. And that hence the like Netflix binging and all the things and all the behaviors people do, endless social media scrolling, all that kind of avoidant behavior. So I know you work with somatics. So before we talk about relationships and shadow, is there anything that you could share specifically in relation to how you have best seen for people to support their nervous system and regulate their nervous system and give them the replenishment and nourishment they need, so they can actually have the wherewithal and energy to do the shadow work and to be supported in it?
Yeah. So many different tools. And I guess maybe I'll just start off by kind of explaining the way that I see all of these things coming together. And then I can talk about different points you might use somatic work in, or ways to do it. But I really see it as, when we understand our shadow, we understand where our edges lie, right? So if we reject ourselves for something, right? I'll try to make an example here. Let's say we have a story about ourselves that we're not very smart or capable, right? Maybe something happened a long time ago. We didn't get good grades because maybe we were more creative. And then that led to this whole story and this identity where we stopped trying. We didn't put effort in. And we, again, made that thought more concrete. I'm not capable. I'm not smart. Right. So I'm just going to hold myself back in life. So if you've developed in that way, for example, and you understand, oh, this, maybe I'm now as an adult can't get jobs and I'm really struggling and I'm behind, the mind is going to want to say, see, continual evidence, you're not smart, you're not capable. So the shadow work there, meeting that edge, would be one, challenging that idea and belief and realizing that it's not truth, and that in some aspect you've created that narrative in your mind and made choices that reflect that, preventing you from being able to shine. And then as an example, just something that I would maybe assign, because with shadow work, we could know, okay, I have this self-rejection. What do we actually do with that? I like to believe that we need an exercise that's going to challenge that in the real world, right? So maybe, for example, just off the top of my head, this figurative person would need to be in front of a group of people and brag about how smart they were. That's not going to feel true. It's going to make them extremely uncomfortable because it's in contradiction to what they have believed for a long time. Or, right, maybe they have to have people reflect back to them and tell them why they think they're smart, and feel does that feel like to receive it? And does my mind go, they're lying, they're just doing this because it's an exercise, I'm not smart, right? So we can play with all the ways the mind is continuing to create this story. And maybe on a more tangible level, their work is to keep applying for a position that they don't think they're smart enough for, until they, again, prove that narrative wrong, but they're taking steps in a direction that is challenging that. So where the somatic work would come in is, you could do stuff before to prepare, but in any of those examples of things that I just made up there, you would feel this activation in your nervous system, because anything that is outside of that zone of comfort that we've become accustomed to will make you uncomfortable in your nervous system. That's where the somatics come in, right? The freeze, the flight, the fight response. So actively overriding that, but it's not about getting to like a level 10 out of 10 uncomfortable, right? That's why it's actually more favorable to look at doing really bite-sized pieces and growing our capacity.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because a lot of practitioners will want to take you right to the 10.
Yeah.
Which and it doesn't actually work. Like, your body will shut down. It won't do it.
Exactly. It's just not, it's not actually how we're designed to grow and change. We're neuroplastic, we can make changes, but we need to have safety and feel like it's within our reach. So absolutely. So if we can find that nice sweet spot of, let's say, a level 5 and have the right tools, right? So maybe it's a practice of breathing. I mean, there's so many different things we can do. One really good, simple one that you can do in pretty much any scenario is working with your peripheral vision. So when we're in a state of activation, our vision narrows in on things. And one thing that we can do really easily is start by just looking at one thing, but then you basically expand your awareness of your whole visual field and take in your entire peripheral vision and just hold that for a little bit while doing some breathing. And that basically tells the mind, I'm actually okay right now, because this is the visual state of a regulated nervous system. So we can basically kind of hack our nervous system when we're anticipating that discomfort through breath, through touch, through like havening, hugging ourselves, rubbing our arms, this peripheral vision and other things to then bring us down. Okay, I'm safe. And then we've then shown the body, hey, this is now partially in my zone of comfort. This is a new normal. And I can continue expanding that and going further and further and further with the somatic work along the way until all of a sudden I'm a very different person, or I'm showing up at least to life very differently.
Yeah, I love that. And there is a lot of power in visualization, at least for me. I'm very visual. Like I'm in my mental field a lot, but like third eye wise, perception wise, I love to visualize in them. And there's also the spiritual eye of the heart, which is I've studied quite a bit in the Gnostic texts, which is like heart seeing and creating that safety from love. Like it's really hard to go back to belief when you're doing shadow work and to examine your beliefs, because it's very, like you said, very somatic and visceral. It's not a logical process. It's an embodied process. So when I see people doing shadow work and they're not doing the somatic work with it that you're talking about, it's just not, it's not going to get you as deep into that release. It will have a minimal impact, but breath and grounding and visualizing and all of the, like you're saying, that trauma hold and all of those things really bring it forward so that it can release. And yeah, I love it. Okay. Well, I love that. That's very practical and I love it. So let's talk about recognizing the shadow in your relationships, which is like, next level.
Yeah, I know. It's just everywhere. 1 minute you think you're good, and all of a sudden it's like, hey-o, I'm here.
Yeah, if you were just working in relationship with yourself to do shadow work, that's one thing. But when it's being reflected back to you in another, that's not so fun.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and if you're listening and you're single and maybe desiring relationship or not, and wherever you're at, you can still practice this shadow work and relationship in all kinds of relationships. I mean, absolutely, it can show up in friendship and family. I tend to talk a lot about romantic relationships. Again, if somebody's single or not, we could look to the past or what's happening presently if you are in a relationship. But the information of the romantic relationship, it helps us see really deeply into our psyche and into our attachment system, how we resource safety from the world, what our beliefs are about ourselves, our deepest fears and insecurities. It's just like, it's all out to play.
It's all there.
in the romantic relationships.
And that's why you attract that specific partner.
Yeah.
Because typically, like I was telling you, with my husband, almost 28, well, we've been together 28 years. We've been married 27, but like, there's no other way. I shouldn't say there's no other way, but for me, has felt like he's such an amazing partner in so many ways. And he's so kind and he's so generous and loving and patient, all those things. And we always trigger each other, but it's like if I had like branched out and like, let's just say got a divorce when we were going to divorce in 2019, we were separated. There was a lot happening with us deconstructing things about life and beliefs. And ultimately we made our way back to each other and decided we were going to make this work, and that we were like not messing around anymore. Like, we're going to face these shadows. So we did a lot. But yes, I just wanted to speak in support of that the recognition of your shadow is more powerful with a romantic partner than you doing your own work or you having any other kind of dynamic. That isn't to leave the single people out of it, but they probably know. They've dated, right? There's something about the romantic connection that is so activating for this kind of work, unlike any other.
Yeah. Yeah, I think as people get closer, they just become even stronger mirrors. And it's really interesting with attraction because it speaks so much about our, I guess, as simply put as I can, it speaks to what happened in childhood when we were growing up. And for a lot of people, there's a core missing need, a core wound, a core pain that was developed that essentially people will carry out in relationship and be looking for that to be met by a partner. And they often pick people who resemble somebody from the past that wasn't able to give them that thing. And then they continue to not give them that thing. And there we have that whole dynamic playing out.
Or in my case, my husband was the opposite of what of unhealthy masculine I had attracted. And so I, on some level, was like rejecting that he was so good and nice. Does that make sense? So it was kind of a flipped situation.
Yeah. And before that, were you attracted to more people who were more chaotic?
Like I wanted the masculine to love me. So I picked hard people, people who had a lot of resistance and blocks and walls because they had feminine wounds and masculine wounds. And so like, yeah, not that we all don't, but like one person in particular that I almost married before I married my husband, it was a very emotionally abusive situation because I wanted to prove that I was lovable and he didn't seem to have the capacity, but I thought I could be the one that healed that for him. And that was actually like, I had dated other guys that kind of had that like jocular sort of removed, sort of toxic masculine kind of thing going on. And this was all unconscious. I had no idea until many, many years later, but that was not my husband. He came in as a gift to show me what it means to be a healthy masculine.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that pattern is so common and so known, that kind of chasing or trying to prove or pick me, I want to prove how worthy I am. And it could model an unavailable parent figure where we're trying to get the love and gain and see, you remind me of that parent. And so essentially I'm trying to complete that cycle by getting you to love me like they never did. Because on one hand, we don't see that separation. Part of our mind is extremely primitive, right? So part of our mind just works through felt senses and it doesn't actually know the separation between people. It's just like, oh, this reminds me of this situation and this feeling.
Because it's always trying to make those associations. Yeah.
Exactly. So, in this example, which it can totally flip-flop, where you're in this pattern of chasing and in these more unhealthy dynamics, and then you get to a place where it is more steady, and then there's something else that can happen there. It could be maybe like the feeling of, well, I'm bored now because you're not triggering all my discomfort. Or
I need some drama. Come on.
Exactly. Or like the things you're initially attracted in them become the things that you despise the most. Because another thing happens in attraction where we tend to be attracted to people where they have something that we want. So we're like, oh, I like their charisma. I want more of that. I want to be more like that. Or like their success. I want to be more successful. Or their generosity and their kindness. I want to be more like that. But if that's something we've not allowed ourselves to express because it's somewhere in our shadow, there's some self-rejection that says you can't have that or you're not like that, then we can at the same hand be attracted to that characteristic and also judgmental of it, just like we would be towards ourselves. I want it, but I'm not allowing it to come through or what have you. So there's a lot of contradiction to the shadow, and it just kind of felt through experiencing these dynamics and flip-flopping as we do as humans. But I'd say contradiction is very much a pillar of shadow work when you begin exploring it and putting it out into the light.
Absolutely. I love that. So one thing that you did mention to me earlier when we were exchanging like, how deep do we want to go with this, is there was a couple of elements or foundational ingredients to shadow work. And what would you say those two are? The two C's. which I love, compassion and curiosity. I'm just going to prompt that for you because you wrote it down for me. I'm like, that's so powerful. So why are those the foundational pieces to doing the shadow work? Compassion and curiosity, whether it's shadow work in a relationship or shadow work with yourself.
Yeah, well, so shadow work is the self-rejection. Things exist in our shadow because we've learned to reject and try to deny certain aspects of ourselves, right? So our capacity to be greedy or arrogant or jealous or vain or judgmental or sad and angry and messy, all these things that we deny as human beings and we push away, end up, manifesting in other ways in our lives that we've been talking about. But if we continue to judge and shame ourselves for the ways that we're acting or struggling or so on, then we don't get anywhere. Whereas if we can remain curious and compassionate, we can understand so much more. And if we're trying to heal self-rejection and wounds that we've been holding on to for a long time, we have to see our own innocence and we have to be compassionate and we have to be curious to get there. So we're really trying to undo points in time in anyone's life that they felt like they were not enough and that this part of them was bad. Therefore, hide it, don't show it, keep it under control. So we have to bring that part forward and say, hey, when did I first learn this was bad? Hey, can I accept that this is part of my humanness? Can I love this part even though once upon a time I was told that it was not okay, right? Can I bring all of that into the light and practice curiosity and compassion? Because we'll always get to a place of being able to see our own innocence if we don't shut down to I'm wrong, bad.
Yeah. Just that inner child piece of just, we are all innocent. We're doing the best that we can with what we know. And if the subconscious is running amok and the unconscious is running amok, which it is, that's not something that we can keep going into shame about. So as if we are avoiding that work in ourselves, the compassion and the curiosity and the asking, we're going to just project like hell onto our partner. Because if we feel self-critical, if we are self-condemning, if we are feeling self-shame, then it's a given that the closest person to us is going to be on the receiving end of that projection. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you see it, because it's never about them. I mean, well, mm-hmm. Rarely. I mean, everyone's messy, but really, when we get triggered by someone, it's an invitation to look at why we're being triggered. Mm-hmm. What is the unhealed part in me mm-hmm. that is reacting so strongly to that behavior?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's some with shadow work, like there's the clear-cut path of I'm judging them for this thing, therefore it's somewhere within me. Either I do something very similar and I don't love that part of myself, or I'm judging you or projecting onto you because I don't allow myself to do what you're doing because I told myself that was wrong and bad. Mm-hmm. Therefore, I'm telling you you're wrong and bad. But really, that's actually a part of me too. It's hard for me to look at that or to see myself in you, right? So there's the classic prompt that I use a lot. And anyone, if you're just curious, like how to actually like kind of practice this in action, which would just be something that I see in you, that I see in me, is using people as mirrors, not as separate, right? Not as blame, really. It's just, okay, everyone is a constant invitation to be able to see myself deeper and know myself deeper and love myself deeper. And therefore, I'll be able to, or because of that, I'll be able to then love other people more as well, right? That it's that two-way street. If you hold a lot of self-rejection and shame and blame, you will do that to other people and create all kinds of troublesome situations.
Oh, yes. One thing that I've noticed and been trying to be really like meta aware of is that whoever is in front of me at any given point in time, whoever's been brought to me, let's just say I've attracted, right? No matter who, what, when, where, like if it's at the grocery store, if it's a child, a friend, or whatever, somebody is in front of me. That person has something to teach me about myself. And it's just like, it's so interesting because we get into these like power, like inner struggles. I don't want to say power struggles, but it's like this war inside of ourselves. Like, oh, I see that. Oh, I don't want to see that. Oh my gosh, and for me, it's just trusting that I'm being shown on a regular basis what I actually believe about life and people and myself through these interactions that just, come upon me. And sometimes it happens on social media. It doesn't have to be an in-person thing. It's like somebody can post something and be like, "Ooh, I'm super triggered by that. Why?" And so I just want to offer that. There's just like when we work with these emotional triggers, we get to immediately go within instead of throwing it out there.
Yeah. And creating more separation. We actually get to be like, okay, here we go. It's my thing about this. All right. And then, let's say this is happening in the real world, then maybe you actually have an opportunity to connect with somebody you didn't think that you could connect to, and maybe gain a lot from that connection. Or maybe it's a lover or a friend, or, whatever might come from that. But that dissolving of separation, of saying, I see myself in you, therefore I can love myself and see my own innocence, and I can see that within you. And I'm now actually able to connect more. And connection is how we form our lives, right? It's how businesses get started and careers form, and we find our passions and our hobbies and travel and friends, and like everything is about connection. So our ability to connect is very much rooted in our ability to see ourselves in other people, to love ourselves, and to practice the compassionate inquiry of self and other too, right? And seeing one another's innocence. So
beautiful.
It's everything, really.
Yeah. And that kind of circles back to what we were talking about at the beginning of our deepest fear, is that we are going to be alone. Yeah. But in actuality, you can never be alone. There's this deep interconnectivity with all that is. And the more that we have this courage and compassion, the more we can feel that. Actually feel it, not believe it in our head, but feel that connection. So #goals, right? Like that's the whole thing. So Jenelle, thank you for this really thought-provoking and chill bump worthy. Like there were a couple times I'm like, ooh, like we're getting into some core stuff here. But where can people find you?
Yeah. So I have a lot of my writing and stuff up on my Instagram, which is just at Jenelle Annette. And then I also have a podcast. It's called Creating Conscious Relationships. So really focusing on the relational aspects of things. And yeah, those are kind of the main areas that I keep my stuff going.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I just want to like reflect back to you that I'm so, the word that's coming to me is awe. I'm in awe of your deep embodied wisdom. You seem young, but you seem old. And like, you have that, it was like, I'm just going to like, when you're my age, you're just going to blowing it out of the water with your work. And I mean that in the most humble, and compassionate, like you just have a reservoir that you can offer this world. And so whatever you've been through, I don't know what it is, you had to go through an initiation to get to where you are. And that's very apparent and obvious. So thank you. Thank you for showing up as you, not just your work, but just as you.
Wow. Thank you. Also just perfectly with this goes perfectly with this episode, but what you see in me is what is within you.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for those words. I really appreciate it. And, I feel the same to you. And thanks for being so committed to this work and spreading it, and can see your passion and your devotion to it as well. I know you've been at it for a long time, and just put out a lot of goodness in the world. So happy to be allies in that, and grateful to be here. And thanks for having me on your show and connecting me with your people. And
beautiful. I hope everyone can go check you out on your Instagram at Jenelle Annette with a JENELLE. Thanks so much.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.